This is Ancient Political Philosophy on Monday, November 16th, 2020. Um, Today I'll be talking about uh, philosophy and Roman life and Cicero's life as a prelude to discussing on moral ends. And I know it says on my notes that I passed out today that we'll turn to books 2 through 4 on Wednesday and 5 on Friday. But I'm going to mildly revise that. We'll do books 2 and 3 on Wednesday, and then 4 and 5 on Friday, the selections that I provided. As I mentioned in my email, the PRQs for Cicero are not due until next Tuesday, the last day of finals at 6:30, the end of the exam period. And so you don't have to worry about turning those things in until next week. So let's take up Cicero and the place of philosophy in human life. First, a little cultural background and also a little philosophic background. What has happened since Plato and Aristotle? Remember the dates we're talking. Socrates lived in the middle 5th century and was executed in 399 400 BCE. So Plato was his student, as you know, and Aristotle his student. So we're talking essentially the Greek world around 400 BCE. So 400 years have passed, and of course, Athens was destroyed, or I should say, Athens was conquered, and substantially, its empire over the Greek and Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, the 22-year-long Peloponnesian War. And of course, Alexander arose in 313, 311, conquered the known world, extending Hellenistic influence and power and Greek thought all the way to the borders of India, including parts of India, and then, of course, died and left a kind of a political vacuum, which then Rome. The Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, I should say, the Roman monarchy, is both mythically and historically understood to begin around 500 BCE or around that century. And then the Roman Republic developed, the monarchy was overthrown, um, and the Republic grew. And so by this point, at the time that Cicero dies, comes to power and dies, and you can follow the chronology of his life in the introduction to our volume. So we're talking essentially about 44 BCE. So about 400 years have taken place, and of course the major development in the overall political historical world is, of course, the rise of Rome as the Roman Republic and Empire. As you'll see, that led to important developments in both larger culture and philosophy. In terms of general culture and religion, the old Olympian civil religion, that is to say, the 12 Olympian deities of Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, and Ares and Apollo and all that, had been incorporated through the Roman epics, like Virgil had composed the Aeneid, which this is a sequel to the Iliad and the Odyssey. So much of Roman culture and religion had been borrowed from Greece and had become the official religion of Rome. Zeus became um, Jupiter, Hera became Juno, and so forth. Athena, Minerva, Aphrodite, Venus, um, Ares, Mars, and Joe Dunn had become Krusty the Clown. So here's the point then about this interesting period, is that civil religion, which was the official religion of the Roman Empire, was still pretty much the guiding light of the masses. And again, as I mentioned, the official religion of Rome, the Roman Republic about to become the Roman Empire. More about that in a minute. And remember, Christianity had not yet appeared. Judaism had in some ways spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world, and there was a Jewish community in Rome. And the Romans were aware of Judaism, but again, it's not until 4 BCE or 7 BCE to 33 AD or CE Common Era that Christianity becomes, of course, Jesus lives, and Christianity then begins to spread throughout the Roman Empire. Eventually, by the way, culminating in the Christianization of the Roman Empire by Constantine in 325, 313 to 325 AD or CE. But here we're still talking about the last stages of the Roman pagan world. Not even the last stages. I mean, don't forget, there's the Roman Empire still has another 500 years to go before its collapse, before the invasion of the Vandals, who TP'd Rome and scribbled graffiti on the walls as they invaded in 410, 411. And the last Roman emperor and senate, I think, lasted to 524, I think, AD. And then the collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to the Dark Ages, in which Facebook and Twitter then came to be the dominant influences in European culture, which is why we call them the Dark Ages. But definitely, we'll talk about the religious situation in Rome in a second, but you'd have to say that among the elites, the political, the cultural, and intellectual elites of Rome, the civil religion had lost its appeal, even though it was officially and oftentimes vigorously enforced. But even among the masses, the influx of foreign religious traditions had weakened the hold on many of the Roman Mediterranean masses. Judaism, Manichaeism, very powerful influence, a residue of Zoroastrianism from Persia in the east, the dualistic religion of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism. Certain Gnostic and Eastern mysticisms. Remember, the Roman Empire stretched almost to India, and therefore many aspects of Eastern mysticism had begun to creep in, and there were Gnostic religious movements who are kind of mysticism in Egypt and other Eastern countries. And also, because of the incorporation of many different conquered peoples into the Roman Empire, they incorporated many of their deities. And generally speaking, the same thing happened, by the way, interestingly enough, within Hinduism, where local deities were assumed into the Hindu pantheon, and the same way that oftentimes local deities were assumed into the Roman pantheon. But meanwhile, philosophy has become something of an acceptable activity. There were philosophic schools and philosophers prior to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but you'd have to say that with the collapse of Greek political power, nevertheless, the influence of Hellenism and Greek culture was probably the single most powerful influence in the Mediterranean world. And so philosophy has in some ways escaped its Greek cocoon, its Greek embryo, and has become universal throughout the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic at that point, which was an empire too. And you'll see that part of what the issue that Cicero is articulating is whether or not philosophy is a foreign activity to Roman life. His discussion of Latin and Greek influences at the beginning of Book 1 is an indication that even though there are powerful Greek schools of thought, and the two ones that we're going to discuss again are, of course, Epicureanism and Stoicism, nevertheless, there's still a sense in which philosophy is viewed as a foreign influence and identified with Greece or Hellenism. But philosophy has also become somewhat popular, and here's the interesting thing: it poses now a different kind of threat than the threat that Socrates and philosophy posed to Athens. Perhaps even a greater threat. There, if you remember, philosophy was viewed as atheism, as an attack on the official piety of the city, because Socrates was accused of being a philosopher, a political philosopher, a philosopher anyway, and ridiculed by and eventually executed for not believing in the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth. So in some ways, that's not, as you'll see, the threat. Rather, philosophy itself becomes problematic in that as you'll see, at least certainly in Cicero's eyes, um, the problem is that the spread of these philosophic schools has spread certain doctrines of nature, um, which are problematic in terms of human dignity and moral coherence and political morality. And in particular, the two most powerful philosophers, Epicurus and the Stoics, from Stoa, which is the Greek word for porch, because supposedly Zeno and other Stoic philosophers preached their philosophy um, from a porch, hence Stoa, porch in Greek, and Stoics, the porchers. Um, so in some ways, it's not just that they've established themselves as mature kinds of philosophy or philosophic thought, but they've also come to kind of supplant and supply the place that religion filled, and so they're kind of filling a gap in the face of the decline of religion. And by the way, and Stoicism, of course, was a very powerful influence eventually in the Roman elites, and even some religious commentators believe that there are elements of Stoicism which you'll recognize in books 3 and 4. Um, um, and by the way, you could say both Epicureanism and Stoicism owe some aspects of their system in the thought of Plato and Aristotle. Although, as you'll see, I think the criticism that Cicero makes is that they're incomplete presentations of aspects of Socratic, Platonic, and Aristotelian philosophy, or they harken back to or absorb pre politically philosophic elements of pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. Um, so I think, by the way, that it's not unlike our situation today. Uh, the old religions in the West seem to be fading. Europe is still nominally a Christian society in the sense that it has all those big cathedrals, and many of the life events of people in Western Europe are still celebrated: christenings, weddings, and funerals in religious institutions. But as a cultural influence, Christianity is all but collapsed in Europe. America, interestingly enough, is probably the most religious, still um, essentially a Christian cultural society. At least the different institutions conduct regular polls of American and European life, and in most of the countries of Europe, church attendance on a regular basis has declined to perhaps less than 1 or 2% throughout England and Germany and France, etc. And even in the prior Catholic countries like Ireland and Italy and Spain, religion has all but collapsed. Um, Probably the most religious Catholic country in Europe is Poland, and partially that was because its anti-Sovietism was widely identified with. I should say, the Catholic Church was widely identified with Polish national resistance to Soviet imperialism. But but in our time, even among America, between 2000 or so and 2020, there was like a 14% decline in church attendance and participation, and especially among young people. And there's no question that perhaps the most important cultural influences are no longer religious, although in America it's a questionable thing, um, but rather the influences of varieties of modern political philosophy, like existentialism or Marxism, in the form of socialism and identity politics. So these powerful modern philosophies pose in some ways the interesting challenges that Stoicism and Epicureanism posed in the time of Cicero. So, what was the? You'll see. I think Cicero took as his philosophic intention or purpose the both the preservation of a certain sense of Romanism and and his desire to incorporate at least what he considers the salutary aspects of Greek philosophy, because I think you can essentially consider Cicero a Platonic or an Aristotelian, an adherent of the academic philosophy. Plato had founded his school called the Academy, and Aristotle's was the Lyceum, the Peripatetics, which literally means to walk around, because supposedly Aristotle taught while lecturing on his feet. Hence, the Lyceum or the Aristotelian school was called the Peripatetics. But but Rome again was in a unique situation politically and culturally, and philosophically. And again, as we noted earlier, in the you can see in the introduction to our volume and in volume one, or book one, Greek philosophy is still seen somewhat as a foreign influence. So, uh, what's the situation in Rome philosophically and politically? Rome had become the world empire, or was on the brink of that status by the end of Cicero's life. In 45 BCE, Julius Caesar, of course, was on the brink of establishing himself as emperor because the institutions of the old republic had failed to provide the stability as Rome grew from the city and the republic to the supreme power on the Italian peninsula to, of course, the greatest and most extensive political entity in the history of the Western world, perhaps in the entire world. I mean, Rome didn't invent empire. Obviously, there had been the Sumerian, the Babylonian, the Hittite, the Egyptian empires, um, and in the east, the Hindu empires and the Chinese empires and the Japanese empires, and in the New World in the Western Hemisphere, the Mayan and Aztec empires. But what was unique about Rome was that it had grown to the point where it was literally transcultural or nearly universal. Um, Almost like the United States of America, there was a great book on America in the 1980s by Ben Wattenberg, a sociologist, uh, entitled "The First Universal Nation," and you can see his thesis that America had absorbed every type of human being, racial, ethnic, religious, from all over the world, and that America was in fact the first nation that represented humanity as humanity. Well, in a sense, you could say that was true of the Roman Empire, um, uh, who which at its height extended all the way from Britain to Africa to Macedonia and what we would consider the Balkans, and all the way to India and Persia. So, um, um, of course, Caesar was assassinated. You can read all about it in Shakespeare's great play and in my musical comedy adoption of Julius Caesar, which I wrote when I was a senior in high school, A Caesar for All Seasons. I took the title from A Man from All Seasons about Sir Thomas More, and 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 I have no restraint, and so of course when I wrote this as my sophomore drama project, it became a big hit. It was performed for my class and another class, and then eventually for the whole school, and then in front of 400 people for a regional meeting of the Future Teachers of America. And just to give you a hint, I mean, in the climactic scene where Caesar is assassinated, the conspirators stab him, and then we had little rubber knives, and we wore sheets, and had fake blood. And see, we were supposed to unfold, and Caesar was supposed to come forward and die to the tune of Oklahoma. Oh, they got me in the shoulder, leg, and side and heart. And yes, what a true genius I was in high school. Anyway, so Caesar was assassinated, but that didn't prevent the empirization of the Roman Republic. Um, his nephew Octavius, the one of the third of the second triumvirate, which included Mark Antony and Lepidus, took over after the assassination of Caesar. And even though the institutions of the Roman Republic, the Senate, etc., were ostensibly preserved, of course, Octavius quickly established himself as the supreme power and instituted the emperorship when he was crowned the Augustus Divinus, the divine August, as both a god and the supreme emperor in 29 BCE. So that's Caesar's. That's the circumstances that surrounded Cicero's life. And the end of his life, by the way, there was a civil war, of course, that followed the assassination of Caesar, and Cicero was identified with the pro-Republican forces, the pro-Senate forces, and Antony had Caesar assassinated. And according to the story, Cicero was fleeing Rome in a bier, the kind of thing that was carried by on two poles. And as the Roman soldiers uh, rode up to his bier, he looked out, and one of the Roman soldiers decapitated him, and that was the end of Cicero's life. So those were the events that formed both his life and his death, and that sets the stage for I think what is the philosophic enterprise of Cicero, and that has to do with Romanism and the way Romans viewed themselves in their political order. Many Romans considered Rome to be the best regime, that political practice had answered the question of the best regime in the same way, in some ways, that Britons um, uh, in the time of the American Revolution under Edmund Burke considered Britain to be in some ways the best regime, and even some Americans admired the British Constitution for certain aspects. John Adams, in some ways, in Hamilton. Um, but you could say that say that many Romans considered that history and practice had answered the question of the best regime, and it was Rome. Why? Because its arrangements enabled Rome to actually rise to first regional and then global, quote unquote, supremacy, and then once supreme, to comprise and include all humanity and varieties into a cosmopolis. Cosmopolis. Cosmos is the Greek word for world, and polis, as you know, is city or state. So Rome, in some ways, by this time, had considered itself to be the first, as we were saying earlier, cosmopolis, the first polis to incorporate the cosmos, the world state, and the universal city, which is literally the translation of the word cosmopolis. So you could say, in some ways, Cicero is probably not the only Roman philosopher, but he's probably the greatest Roman philosopher. And of course, don't forget, he had an active political life, as you can tell from the chronology in the introduction, and was a great rhetor, a great orator and lawyer, and statesman. So I believe it would be fair to say that he saw as his task to assimilate Greek philosophy, still viewed as somewhat foreign, especially Greek political philosophy, to Roman politics and institutions. So that, in some ways, Cicero too seems to embrace the idea that Rome is the complete regime, or the best constitution or regime. But still, he's trying to present Greek philosophy in such a way that Romans can benefit from Greek political and moral teaching, to sort of tutor Romanism, so almost to deserve its self-understanding of best regime or constitution. But also, again, as I was saying, I think he sees as his philosophic and moral and political task to refute these competing schools of philosophy that he sees as pernicious or harmful to human life in terms of individual moral life and political morality and the political order. So, what's the main question of the dialogue? The name of this dialogue in Latin is De Finibus, on ends, and the translator, and generally speaking, this is how this work has been translated um, into English as moral ends. It's a parallel, I think, to the Ethics, because in Book One of the Ethics, as you remember, Aristotle starts out by attaching his moral and political theory, his teaching on virtue, to the natural end or purpose of human life as it applies by nature. Um, and and again, like Plato and Aristotle, and especially Aristotle, Cicero accepts that nature reveals end or purpose. This is a teleological system, to use that fancy word. Telos, remember, is the Greek word for end, target, or purpose. And Aristotle teaches, as does Plato and Socrates, that the universe has a natural completion or end of its natural motion. And the fact that what natural motion is isn't just matter in motion, which is the physics of Epicureanism taken over from Democritus, as we'll see in both today and Wednesday. And also, that's the physics of modern science. That's the notion of Cartesian and Baconian modern science, in which human power is manifest to direct natural motion, which has no natural ends, and therefore human conquest of natural forces supplies a kind of human teleology uh, uh, to natural motion that doesn't exist by nature. And of course, that view is perfected, you might say, especially in modern existentialism or even Darwinism, because Darwin argues you can explain the whole phenomena of natural development not by teleology, but by matter in motion by chance. Again, don't forget, natural selection, which is the core Darwinian mechanism, is essentially an intersection of two modes of chance motion. Chance mutation and chance changes in the environment, which then determine which mutations become survivable Uh, so, uh, uh, as we'll see, the parallel in some ways to our situation and Cicero's situation is not irrelevant. So, what's the deepest and widest question of the dialogue is then how does a grasp of natural purposes of existence, especially human existence, provide guidance for human life, both individual and political, and how does such an understanding serve to refute the pernicious philosophic view of human life, and especially in Epicureanism and Stoicism? And let's be clear, as you'll see as you read through the dialogue, um, Cicero is more open to Stoicism, which at least rested upon something like a spiritual teaching, or at least rested upon the notion that the universe itself was moved towards perfection, whereas opposed to the hedonistic, physical, materialistic nihilism of Epicureanism. Nevertheless, he's a critic of Stoicism too, um, but you'll see he's especially critical of Epicureanism. So, with that in mind, you can see Book One as a pretty fair and accurate introduction to Epicureanism. He lets Torquatus come forward, who's an advocate of this philosophy, a student of Epicurus, not an actual student, but a follower of the school. So, what was Epicureanism? Epicurus was a hedonist, as we've seen in the Republic, the Ethics and the Politics. Hedonism, pleasurism, hedon is the Greek word for pleasure. I've already mentioned this before, and it's on the key terms that I passed out a couple of weeks ago. Hedus is the Greek word for sweet or pleasurable. Hedon, pleasure. Hedonism is pleasurism. Um, and and I think both I think Cicero considers this to be the more substantial challenge to orderly human moral and political life, because it has such secular, if you can use that word, saeculus is the Latin word for world or this world. Secular means then the goods that pertain to this side of the grave, this world, as opposed to the next world or the world to come, the afterlife. So in Book One, Cicero allows, as I designate him in my notes, this talented Epicurean, Torquatus is clearly a thoughtful and articulate fellow, to step forward and present the core of Epicurus' system. And this is what you'll encounter in Book One. Pleasure is the supreme good. Uh, Animal life reveals this, and you'll see, in some ways, not unlike Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, um, Epicurus collapses human life into animal life, or collapses the distinction or undermines the distinction. And you'll see that's rooted in Epicurus's physics, the materialistic physics of Democritus. And you're going to discover in Book One, if you didn't know this already, Democritus was one of the pre-Socratics who argued that all the world was matter in motion. And it is Democritus who coined the critical term atom, from the Greek prefix, which means from which means no or not, like atypical. Tupos is a Greek word too, atypical. Ptomaine isn't the poisoning you get from eating bad eggs. Ptomaine is the Greek word to cut or slice up. So atom literally means something that is not cuttable, because Democritus argued that the material world could be analyzed scientifically by reducing it to that portion of matter, that piece of matter that you couldn't reduce anymore. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, we know the atom is not, today we know that the atom is not the smallest particle. There are a gazillion little subatomic particles like muons and quarks and protons and neutrons and leptons and klingons. Uh, so, um, um, but nevertheless, if you think about it, the standard model of subatomic particles simply takes the Democritean thesis and renders it to even smaller particles. So it's not accidental that Epicurus takes this materialistic philosophy and builds it into a all-encompassing human philosophy. So for Epicurus, and in this system, then pleasure is the supreme good, and 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 by then you could say Epicurus in his school had reached a certain level of intellectual sophistication and had tried to define pleasure as the absence of pain. So you could say that it's both, and this becomes, again, once you take modern political philosophy, this is the underpinning of both Spinozan and Hobbesian and Lockean and Rousseauian psychology, and Freudian psychology, and Marxian psychology, um, that essentially all nature supplies in terms of our experience of existence is pleasure and pain. And we know pain is painful and pleasure is pleasurable. It's great to be a PhD and to be able to be so wise. But it wasn't just the idea of pointing human life to pleasure. The appeal of Epicureanism is also apparent in its atheism. It's an atheistic system. And one of the sweetest forms of bliss that Epicureanism brought to human consciousness was to relieve one of the fear of the gods. I mean, if there are no gods, then you don't have to worry about feeling guilty. You don't have to worry about the punishment, reward and punishment after death. So that actually was probably part of the powerful personal, intellectual, and even cultural appeal of Epicureanism. You didn't have to worry about doing bad things because you wouldn't be punished after death. But as you're going to see, Epicureanism is also an attempt to deal with death and the fear of death. And don't forget, all of this comes from its materialism, its materialist physics. And it had a certain scientific or explanatory or intellectual appeal beyond the simple supernatural and superstitious pieties of the day. So um, uh, it seems to provide the comprehensive view of both nature scientifically as matter in motion, which then provides relief from the fear of guilt and punishment of the gods because it reveals the gods to be superstitions, and reveals that the sum total of human life is this world, this existence. So that's a powerful appeal to somebody seeking to live the good life in this life. And as we'll see, that's what Cicero unfolds in Book 1, and we'll see how he completes his consideration of Epicureanism in Book 2, where he steps forward and refutes it. And that's what we'll turn to on Wednesday.